The paper in Sallie Wainwright's hand was shaking, and it had nothing to do with the morning wind cutting across the open yard of the Hale Ranch. "You have no authority to walk onto this property and start rearranging what doesn't belong to you." Nathan Hale's voice was low, controlled, and more dangerous for it. He stood 6 feet of coiled fury in the doorway of his own farmhouse, his jaw set hard as iron, his dark eyes fixed on the woman who had arrived with the sunrise, a carpetbag, and apparently no concept of boundaries. "I don't care what that letter says." "The letter," Sallie said calmly, holding the paper out toward him, "says that your father invited me here. It says that Elias Hale contracted my services for exactly 1 season, with full authority to implement changes to this operation. It has your father's signature on it. Would you like to read it again, or would you prefer to continue pretending you haven't already read it twice?" Nathan snatched the letter from her hand. He had read it. He had read it the night before, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a kerosene lamp burning low, and he had felt the ground shift under him in a way it hadn't since they'd lowered his father into the earth 3 weeks ago. "My father is dead," he said, and the words cost him something. She could see that, even in her brief knowing of him. "He is," Sallie said, "and before he died, he spent the last of his savings writing to my employer in Denver and arranging for me to come here. Not because he didn't believe in you, Mr. Hale, because he believed in this land and he wanted it saved." The word saved landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Nathan's knuckles whitened around the letter. Behind him, the ranch stretched out in the early light of that late April morning in 1884, and it told its own story, a story of a season's worth of debt, of fences that needed mending, of cattle numbers that had dropped below the margin a working ranch needed to survive, of a drought the previous summer that had burned through the pasture grass and left the hayfields thin and brittle. It was a story of a man fighting alone and losing. Sallie had seen it the moment the buckboard had brought her up the road from Rawlings. She had not looked away from it. She had cataloged every broken thing with the precise, clear-eyed attention that her 3 years working for the Denver Agricultural Advisory Board had trained into her. She had seen worse. She had turned worse around. But she had never had to convince a man who looked like Nathan Hale to let her do it. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, with the hands of a man who had worked this land since boyhood. His grief was raw and recent, and it sat on him like a second skin. And beneath the grief, she could already sense something else, a stubborn, aching pride that might be more dangerous to this operation than the debt itself. "Mr. Hale," she said, and she kept her voice even because she had learned that evenness was sometimes the most powerful thing a woman could bring to a room full of resistance. "I arrived this morning. I have exactly 1 season, roughly from now until the first hard freeze in October. I have a plan. You can fight me on every step of it and you will lose the ranch anyway. Or you can let me work." She reached down and picked up the second bag she had set by the fence post, the one that held her ledgers and her maps, and the soil reports she had requested from the county agent in Carbon County 2 weeks before she had ever set foot in Wyoming. She walked past him into the house. Nathan Hale stood in his doorway for a long moment, staring out at the broken fence line and the patchy pasture and the blue Wyoming sky going gold at its edges, and he thought about his father's hands writing that letter, and he did not follow her to throw her out. It was not much of a surrender, but it was a beginning. 6 weeks earlier, Elias Hale had been sitting in the back room of the Carbon County Land Office with a man named Gerald Pitt, who held the mortgage on the Hale Ranch. Pitt was not a cruel man in the way that storybook villains are cruel. He was worse than that. He was reasonable. He presented facts with a gentle smile, and the facts were these. The note on the property would come due at the end of October 1884. In order to meet that note, the Hale operation would need to significantly increase its cattle output, improve its grazing rotation, repair the south water line that had collapsed the previous summer, and find a market for the beef that didn't root through the Cheyenne buyer who had been systematically underpaying ranchers in Carbon County for 2 seasons running. Elias had known all of this. He had also known that Nathan, for all his strength and all his love of the land, had never run the business end of the operation alone. That had always been Elias' domain. Numbers, contracts, market relationships. Nathan knew cattle and land and whether the way other men knew their own faces in a mirror. But the ledger books were a different language, and Elias had not taught it to him early enough, and now there was no time. So Elias had written a letter to the Denver Agricultural Advisory Board, and the board had sent Sallie Wainwright. She was 27 years old, born in Missouri, educated at a women's seminary in St. Louis before the money ran out, and she had turned to the only practical thing she could do with her knowledge of soil science and crop rotation and livestock management, which was to hire herself out as a ranch consultant in an era when such a thing barely existed and certainly didn't exist for women. She had spent 3 years building a reputation that she had to rebuild every time she walked through a new gate, because every new gate was attached to a man who did not believe she could do what she said she could do until she had done it. Nathan Hale, she suspected within the first hour of knowing him, was going to be the hardest gate yet. He did not throw her out that first morning, but he also did not make it easy. He sat across the kitchen table from her while she spread her maps and her soil reports and her cattle tallies, and he watched her with arms folded and an expression that was equal parts grief and skepticism and something she couldn't quite name yet, and he answered her questions in short, tight sentences. How many head currently? 212. Down from 340 2 seasons ago. The South Water Line. What collapsed, the main feed or the junction? A pause. He looked at her with something that flickered toward surprise. The junction at the Lower Creek crossing. Can it be repaired or does it need to be replaced? Replaced. Maybe 60 feet of pipe, Sallie wrote in her ledger. What's your relationship with the Hendersons to the northwest? Their grazing land borders yours at the upper pasture. Another pause, longer this time. Complicated, Sallie looked up. Complicated how? Nathan unfolded his arms and pressed both hands flat on the table. My father and Roy Henderson had an agreement about the upper pasture. Shared grazing in dry years, split water rights from the creek that runs the boundary. Roy died 2 years ago. His son, Dex Henderson, does not honor his father's agreements. Does he have legal right to the water? That, Nathan said, is being contested. Sallie made a note. Hidden legal liability, water rights dispute, address immediately. She kept her face neutral, but inside she felt the familiar tightening of a challenge taken seriously. This was not a simple problem of poor cattle management. This was a compound crisis: debt, drought damage, water access, market manipulation, and the grief of a man trying to run an operation alone after losing the person who had made it make sense. Any one of those problems alone would take work. Together, they constituted what her colleague in Denver liked to call a full catastrophe. Sallie Wainwright had a complicated relationship with full catastrophes. She tended to find them interesting. All right, she said, closing her ledger. I want to walk the property today, all of it. Can you spare a horse? Nathan looked at her for a moment, then stood. I'll take you myself, he said. She had not expected that. She had expected him to point her toward a stable hand and go back to whatever a man in his position did alone on a broken morning. But he pulled on his coat and his hat and he walked her out to the barn, and he saddled 2 horses with the efficient, almost unconscious skill of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and they rode out together into the April morning. It was a beautiful morning in spite of everything. The high Wyoming sky was enormous and clear, the kind of blue that looked painted, and the mountains to the west still held their snow. The land that rolled out before them was capable of great richness. She could feel it even through the damage of the previous dry summer. The soil was good, the topography was favorable. There were places along the creek drainage where the grass was already coming back thick and strong. She said so, and Nathan looked at her sideways from under the brim of his hat. You know soil, he said. It was not quite an accusation. It was something more careful than that. "I spent 2 years studying it formally and 3 working in it practically," she said. "Your father's pastures were well managed before the drought. The overgrazing that happened after was a reaction, I suspect. When the grass thinned, someone pushed more cattle onto what was left trying to compensate." A muscle jumped in Nathan's jaw. "That was my decision." "It's a common decision," she said, without softening it or sharpening it, just stating it. "And it compounds the problem. But the good news is that soil in this condition with this much natural drainage can recover in a single season if the cattle rotation is managed properly. You could close off the south pasture entirely until July and let it come back." "I can't close the south pasture. That's a third of my grazing." "You can if we bring the north pasture back into rotation. The fencing up there is down in 4 places. Then we fix it." She said we and meant it, and she saw him register the word. They rode for 2 hours, and she asked questions constantly, and he answered them, sometimes reluctantly, and sometimes with a sudden rush of detail that told her he had been holding his observations about his own land inside himself for lack of anyone to tell them to. He knew the drainage patterns of every section. He knew which soil held moisture and which shed it. He knew where the grass would come in thick if given the chance, and where it was permanently compromised by the alkaline deposits in the southwest corner. It was not the knowledge of a man who had given up. It was the knowledge of a man who loved a place so deeply that he had memorized it the way other men memorized poetry, not for any practical purpose, but because he couldn't help it. By the time they turned back toward the ranch house, Sallie had filled 12 pages in her ledger, and she had also, though she did not yet put a name to it, begun to understand Nathan Hale in a way that felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure. The first week was a war of logistics. Sallie established herself in the small guest room off the back of the ranch house, which had clearly not been used in years and smelled of dust and old lavender, and she set up her workspace at the kitchen table, which meant that Nathan's kitchen was no longer entirely his own. He accepted this with the tight-lipped resignation of a man outvoted in his own territory, and he made a point of arriving at the table first every morning to drink his coffee in the brief peace before she appeared with her maps. But she always appeared. The ranch hands, 3 of them, Clarence, who was 60 and had worked for Elias Hale for 20 years, Tommy, who was 19 and earnest to a fault, and a lean, weathered man everyone called Pike, who had arrived the previous summer looking for work, and had stayed because he was good with horses, regarded her arrival with varying degrees of suspicion. Clarence watched her with the wary respect of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that competence came in unexpected packages. Tommy simply followed whatever order came most recently, which meant that once Sallie started giving orders, he followed hers. Pike watched her without expression and did exactly what she asked of him, no more and no less. By the end of the first week, she had them all rotating the cattle out of the south pasture and beginning fence repairs on the north section. She had written to the county agent about the water rights dispute. She had drafted a new supply list and identified 3 places where the operation was spending money it didn't need to spend. She had also, inadvertently, started a conversation about the Henderson problem that was going to force a confrontation neither she nor Nathan was fully ready for. Dex Henderson was 25 years old and had inherited his father's land along with his father's tendency toward aggression when challenged. He rode onto the Hale property on the 6th morning of Sallie's tenure without invitation, and he found her alone at the fence line of the upper pasture where she and Tommy had been measuring for replacement posts. Sallie was aware of him before he spoke, the way you are aware of a shadow changing shape. She turned and looked at him steadily. "You the woman they brought in from Denver," he said, walking his horse slowly along the fence line in the proprietary way of a man testing how much space he could occupy. "I am," she said. "Nathan Hale can't save this ranch with ledger books and a female consultant," Henderson said. "He ought to know that by now. My offer for the south section stands. 20 cents on the dollar of assessed value. It's a fair price for land that's been run into the ground. Sallie looked at him. 20 cents on the dollar is not a fair price. It is an insult dressed as an offer. And I'd advise you to resolve the water rights dispute through the county clerk's office rather than by applying pressure. Because if you continue to apply pressure, I will recommend that Mr. Hale involve the Territorial Land Board, and those proceedings tend to be slow and expensive for everyone. Henderson's face went a color that was not a pleasant color. You don't know what you're walking into, he said. I know exactly what I'm walking into, she said pleasantly. Now, if you have legitimate business with Mr. Hale, the house is that direction. If you don't, I'll thank you to step back off this property. Henderson left. Tommy, who had gone very still during the exchange, let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since Henderson rode up. That was remarkable, he said. Sallie went back to measuring fence posts. Write down 24 feet between the third and fourth markers. We're going to need different lumber than I ordered. She did not mention the Henderson visit to Nathan that evening, because she had decided to handle that thread first through legal channels before raising it as a confrontation. This was, in retrospect, a miscalculation. Nathan found out about it from Clarence the following morning. He came into the kitchen where Sallie was eating breakfast with a look on his face that was a specific mixture of anger and something that might have been fear for her safety, though it was dressed up as anger because that was the available garment. Henderson was on my property and you didn't tell me. Sallie set down her fork. I told him to leave and he left. This isn't your fight to manage alone, Nathan said. Henderson is not a safe man. His father was difficult. Dex is worse. The dark past between those families and ours has teeth in it, Sallie, and you don't know the shape of them. It was the first time he had called her by her first name. They both registered it, and neither of them acknowledged it, because they were both people who understood that some moments are best allowed to pass unmarked. I'm filing a formal request with the county clerk this week to have the water rights issue reviewed by the Territorial Land Board, she said. Getting it onto the legal track protects you better than a confrontation in a field. Henderson's claim on that water is weak. I've looked at the original survey documents. Nathan pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. You've looked at the survey documents. The county agent's office mailed them on Tuesday. He looked at her across the table and something in his expression shifted, some tightening gave way. Not fully, not permanently, but she saw it. What do the documents say? They say that the creek running the north boundary was established as shared access in the original 1871 land grant that Elias Hale's claim was drawn against. The access cannot be exclusively denied to either party without a formal legal proceeding. Henderson blocking your use of that water without a court order is technically an unlawful interference with established water rights. Nathan was quiet for a moment. My father knew this. Your father was hoping not to need it, Sallie said. He hoped Roy Henderson would keep the old agreement. Roy died and the hope died with him. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the morning birds were just starting up in the cottonwoods along the drainage, and the sound was almost delicate against the weight of everything they were sitting with. Thank you, Nathan said finally. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. The month of May moved through the Wyoming grassland with the particular urgency of a short growing season that knows its own limits. Sallie drove the operation with the focused energy of someone who had learned, through experience, that hope was only useful when it was attached to specific action items with deadlines. She drew up a rotational grazing schedule that covered every section of the property through the end of October. She negotiated with a lumber supplier in Rawlings for the fence materials, leveraging a payment structure that spread the cost across the season against the projected cattle sale revenue. She found out about a buyer in Laramie who was operating outside the Cheyenne cartel arrangement and paying market rate, and she drafted a letter of preliminary inquiry that Nathan signed and sent off. Nathan watched all of this with the look of a man who has been handed a tool he doesn't fully understand and is beginning to wonder if it might actually work. He also watched Sallie herself, though he would not have admitted it in those terms. He watched the way she moved through a day, with a kind of purposeful grace that never wasted motion. He watched her with his ranch hands, direct and specific and unshowy, no performance of authority, just the actual thing. He watched her in the evenings when the work was done, and she sat at the kitchen table with her ledger, a glass of water at her elbow, her dark hair beginning to slip out of its pins as the day wore on, making notes in a hand so small and precise it looked engraved. There was a hidden motive in his watching that he refused to examine. He had been alone in this house and on this land for a very long time, longer even than since his father's death, because the loneliness had begun when his mother left when he was 12, and deepened when the girl he had planned to marry, Clara Foss from the next valley, had chosen a banker from Cheyenne 8 years ago. He had filled the space with work, and work had not been enough, and he had known it was not enough, and he had kept filling it with work anyway because that was the only filling he had available. Sallie Wainwright walked through the door he had not known was still there. He did not do anything about it. He was a man of considerable self-discipline, and he also had the humility to understand that she was here to do a job, that she had no reason to want anything from him beyond professional cooperation, and that the feelings beginning to form in him were likely a product of grief and gratitude and the enforced proximity of a house with thin walls and a kitchen table that had become, over the first 2 weeks of May, the most charged piece of furniture he had ever owned. He was wrong about what she wanted, but neither of them knew that yet. The cattle rotation began to show results by the 2nd week of May. The south pasture, closed off and left to recover, was already putting on new growth along its eastern edge where the soil was richest. The north pasture, newly fenced and reopened, offered the herd a fresh section they moved into with the gratifying enthusiasm of animals following their own best instincts. Sallie rode the fence lines every other day to check the repair work and monitor the grass growth, keeping a running record in her field notes that would form the basis of her end-of-season report. Nathan rode with her most days. He told himself this was because he needed to keep an eye on what was happening on his own property. Clarence, who had known Nathan since he was 6 years old and had the old man's gift for seeing clearly without speaking out of turn, watched them ride out together and said nothing, but he smiled into his coffee cup in the mornings. On the 3rd Friday of May, they rode out to the far northwest corner of the property to check a section of fence that Tommy had reported needed additional work, and they found that it didn't need additional work. It needed to be completely rebuilt. A spring runoff surge had undermined the posts along a 40-foot stretch and taken them down into the creek bed below. Nathan stood at the edge of the washout and looked at it, and Sallie saw the moment when the accumulation of the season's challenges hit him all at once, the way it does sometimes, when one more thing stacks onto the pile and the pile exceeds the architecture of a person's endurance. He didn't say anything for a long time. "We can rebuild this," she said. "I know we can rebuild it," he said. "Then what is it?" He turned to look at her, and in the bright spring light on that high ground, with the mountains white behind him and the creek silver below, he looked like every difficult thing he was carrying, and like someone who had been carrying it a very long time without putting it down. "My father built that fence," he said. "That section there, the post spacing, that's his work. He built it the year I was born. I used to run my hand along the posts when I was a kid because the spacing was so even it felt like something you could measure the world by." Sallie was quiet. She had learned over 3 years of working in other people's grief and crisis that there were moments when the most useful thing was not to fill the silence. "He should have told me the books were in trouble," Nathan said. "Before it got this far, I could have done something, I would have done something." "He was protecting you," she said. "That's not always useful, but it's usually love." Nathan made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. He looked at her with an expression that was open in a way she hadn't seen from him before, raw and real and undefended. "He was wrong," Nathan said, "about protecting me, but he was right about you." Sallie felt something shift inside her carefully and without permission. "He never met me," she said. "He wrote to the board and asked for their best person," Nathan said. "I read his letter when I was going through his papers. He was specific. He said, send someone who won't be intimidated by what needs doing. Someone who sees a broken thing and thinks about how to fix it rather than whether to leave." He paused. "That's you." She wanted to say something practical. She was very good at practical. But standing on that washed-out hillside in the Wyoming spring with Nathan Hale looking at her like that, practical was briefly unavailable. "We should get the measurements for the new posts," she said. Nathan said, "Yes," and neither of them moved for another moment, and then they both moved at the same time, and their hands both reached for the same survey tape in the saddlebag, and his fingers closed over hers briefly, and then he let go, and they took the measurements, and the moment folded itself away into the afternoon. But it did not disappear. June arrived with a heat that worried Sallie in the first week, because the memory of the previous summer's drought was written into the land's scars, and heat in early June carried echoes of it. She adjusted the grazing rotation and increased the frequency of the creek access rotation to reduce stress on the herd. She wrote to the county agent asking for the seasonal rainfall forecasts. She consulted with Nathan about which sections of the property held moisture longest. He knew. He always knew. That was the thing about Nathan Hale that she had come to count on in a way she had not anticipated. His knowledge of this land was not merely practical knowledge. It was intimate. He understood the ranch the way you understand a person you have spent your whole life beside. The water rights case moved forward through the county clerk's office. The county agent, a meticulous man named Cartwright who had the careful bearing of someone who had spent 20 years mediating between stubborn landowners, reviewed the original survey documents and confirmed what Sallie had told Nathan. The water access was shared under the original grant language. He filed the formal notification to Dex Henderson, and Henderson received it, and that was where things became complicated again. Henderson's response was not legal. Henderson's response was to have 2 of his men ride the north fence line of the Hale property at odd hours, not crossing, not touching anything, but making their presence known in the way that pressure makes itself known without technically breaking anything. It was the kind of behavior that was designed to intimidate, and it was working on Tommy, who came to the ranch house one morning looking pale, and it was working on Nathan, who took his rifle off the wall and locked his jaw in a way that told Sallie he was considering a response that would benefit no one. She intercepted him at the barn. "Don't," she said. "He's riding my fence line with armed men. He's riding near your fence line and he hasn't crossed it, and if you ride out there with a rifle, you will give him an incident he can use. He wants that. He wants you angry and reactive because angry and reactive men make mistakes and mistakes can be used against them." She put her hand on his arm and felt the rigidity in it, the controlled fury that he was managing only barely. "Let the legal process work. Henderson is trying to pull you into a fight because he knows he's losing the legal one." Nathan looked down at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face. He breathed. "You're doing it again," he said. "What? Being right about things I don't want you to be right about." She kept her hand there a moment longer than she meant to, and then she took it back. "Write a formal complaint to the county sheriff about the harassment," she said. "Document the dates and times. That's the move." He wrote the complaint. Cartwright at the county office received it. The sheriff's deputy rode out to speak with Henderson. Henderson's men ceased their fence line riding. The legal pressure built quietly toward Henderson's disadvantage. But the weeks of that pressure had drawn something between Nathan and Sallie that was no longer simply professional. He sought her opinion not just on the ranch decisions but on other things, the way you seek the opinion of someone whose mind you've come to trust. She found reasons to stay in the kitchen after dinner rather than retreating to her room, because the kitchen in the evenings was where Nathan sat with his coffee and sometimes talked, and she had found that she was deeply interested in what he said. He told her about growing up on this land, the particular way the light fell across the west pasture in August afternoons, the winter he was 10 when the snow came so deep that he and his father had spent 2 days digging a path to the barn by hand, the strange and specific geography of a boyhood shaped entirely by one place. He told her about his mother leaving, briefly, and without excess feeling, in the way of a man who has long since made peace with a wound that never entirely closed. He told her about the cattle he'd raised from calves and sold, and the ones he hadn't been able to sell, and the ones he'd lost in the drought, and how each loss had been specific, not an abstraction, but an individual thing with a name and a history. She told him about Missouri and the seminary and the professors who had treated her interest in agricultural science as an eccentricity to be managed rather than an aptitude to be trained. She told him about the first ranch she'd ever consulted on, a disaster of overconfidence in Arizona, and the second one in Colorado that had been her first real success, and the particular satisfaction of a soil report that showed recovery in a section that had been considered ruined. She told him carefully about the engagement she had ended before coming to Denver, a man who had been kind and respectable and had wanted her to stop working, and how she had understood, sitting in a parlor in St. Louis with that conversation happening around her, that she was not capable of stopping working, that the work was not a thing she did but a thing she was. Nathan listened to all of this with the focused attention of a man who knows the difference between hearing someone and understanding them. He was a fool, Nathan said, about the engagement she had ended. He was a reasonable man with reasonable expectations, Sallie said. A reasonable man with reasonable expectations would have understood what he was asking you to give up, Nathan said. That's not reasonable. That's small. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the late June lamplight, and she thought, here is a man who does not find me too much. The thought surprised her with its weight. The Laramie buyer wrote back at the end of June. His name was James Forsyth, and he was operating a purchasing operation out of Laramie that served several large operations further east, and he was interested in Hale Ranch beef, and his offered price was 60% higher than what the Cheyenne cartel buyer had been paying. Nathan read the letter twice, and then handed it to Sallie without speaking. She read it and felt the season's first real surge of something that was not quite hope and not quite certainty, but was somewhere between them. You'll need to increase the herd, she said, to make this worth Forsyth's route. He's looking for a minimum of 300 head for the fall drive. I have 212. You have 212 right now. If the calving numbers this summer match what your father recorded in good years, you could be at 250 by August. To get to 300, you'd need to acquire additional cattle. Nathan was quiet, calculating. There's a man in Sweetwater County who's been trying to sell off part of his herd. Prices have been down, and he's looking to reduce his stock costs. I might be able to arrange a purchase on favorable terms if I could offer to include his cattle in the Laramie drive. Sallie's pen was already moving. What's his name? Walter Briggs. His spread is about 40 miles northwest of here. Write to him today, she said. And write to Forsyth accepting the terms. Lock this in before the end of the week. Nathan wrote both letters that evening. Sallie addressed the envelopes. They sat across the table from each other, doing it in the close, comfortable efficiency of two people whose orbits have begun to overlap in ways that feel natural rather than deliberate, and neither of them spoke much, and the silence between them was not empty but full of all the things they had not yet found the moment to say. The first day of July arrived with a thunderstorm that rolled in from the northwest and spent 3 hours over the Hale Ranch delivering what the county forecast had predicted, and Sallie had cautiously hoped for, a deep, soaking rain that the drought-scarred soil absorbed with the grateful urgency of something too long denied. She stood on the ranch house porch and watched it come down, and she felt the season turning in some fundamental way. Nathan stood beside her. He had come out to check on the barn before the worst of it hit, and the worst of it had already hit before he came back. And so he stood on the porch with her because there was nowhere more immediate to be. "This is what you were hoping for," he said. "The south pasture will respond to this remarkably," she said. "We'll see new growth within a week, enough to support a supplemental herd rotation by late July if the cattle numbers from Briggs come through." "Sallie," he said. She turned to look at him. The rain was very loud and very close, and the porch was only as wide as two people standing side by side, which they were. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer it honestly without calibrating for what you think I want to hear." "I always answer honestly," she said. "I know you do," he said. "That's why I'm asking." He was looking at her with that direct, undefended quality that she had come to recognize as his deepest self, the man beneath the grief and the pride and the layered defenses. "When this season ends, when the note is paid and the ranch is back on its feet, what are you doing next?" She had been asked versions of this question before by other clients, and she had always had a simple answer. She had the next assignment waiting. There was always a next assignment. She opened her mouth to give that answer and found that she did not actually know if it was still true. "I don't know," she said. He nodded once as if she had confirmed something. "I'm going to ask you something else in a while," he said, "when I've earned the right to ask it." The rain came down hard between them and the pasture. "All right," she said. They stood there until the storm eased. Walter Briggs came through in the third week of July with an answer to Nathan's letter that was better than either of them had expected. Briggs had 82 head he was looking to move before the end of the summer, and he was willing to sell 60 of them at a price that, when Sallie ran the numbers against the projected Forsyth purchase price, represented a profitable investment, even factoring in the cost of the transport and the additional grazing requirements through September. Nathan rode to Sweetwater County himself to make the final arrangements with Briggs, and he was gone for 3 days. Sallie, alone at the ranch with Clarence and Tommy and Pike, managed the operation with the same focused efficiency she always brought to it, but she was also aware, in a way she had not previously allowed herself to be aware, of the particular quality of an absence. The ranch house kitchen in the evenings without Nathan in it was a different thing than it had been in April when she arrived. She had not anticipated that. She made a note in her personal journal, which was separate from her professional ledger, that she might have a problem. She also wrote in her journal that the problem felt less like a trap and more like a door. Nathan came back on the third evening with the purchase arrangements finalized and Briggs's handshake agreement in his coat pocket, and he walked through the kitchen door and found Sallie at the table with her ledger and her lamp, and his face when he saw her was the face of a man who had also been thinking about an absence. 60 head, he said. Briggs will deliver them in 2 weeks. I know, she said. You sent a telegraph from Rawlings this morning. He sat down. He had been 3 days on horseback and trail, and he looked it, dusty and rode tired, but his eyes were clear with the particular light of a man who has done something that moved his situation forward, and the light in them when he looked at her had another quality that she was no longer going to pretend not to see. The water rights ruling came in today, she said. He stopped. Cartwright's office received the Territorial Land Board's finding this afternoon. Shared access confirmed under the original 1871 grant language. Henderson cannot legally restrict your access to the North Boundary Creek. His appeal window is 60 days, but Cartwright says the grounds for appeal are thin. Nathan sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "My father would have been glad." "Yes," she said, "he would have." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and this time neither of them pretended it was incidental or accidental. "I said I wanted to earn the right to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I know you came here to do a job," he said. "I know you have other places to go and other operations to save and a life that was fully formed before you arrived at my gate. I know the season ends in October, and I have no right to ask you to let it end differently than you planned." He turned her hand over in his and held it with a careful, deliberate gentleness, the way a man holds something he is afraid to break. "But I am going to ask you anyway, because I have been a coward about enough things in my life, and I will not be a coward about this." Sally's heart was doing something complicated, and she was choosing not to interfere with it. "Sallie Wainwright," Nathan said, "I would like very much to see if there is something between us that wants to stay. Not because you're saving my ranch, though you are saving my ranch, and I am more grateful than I know how to say. But because you are the most remarkable person I have ever sat across a kitchen table from, and I have been trying very hard for 3 months not to be in love with you, and I appear to have failed." The lamplight was warm and the summer was outside the window, and the solved problems were stacked up like victories on the shelf, and the remaining problems were manageable, and the cattle were growing fat on the recovering pasture, and Sallie Wainwright made a decision. "Ask me to stay," she said. "Stay," he said. "Yes," she said. He came around the table, and she stood up to meet him, and he kissed her in the lamplight of his kitchen, with the gentleness and the terrible carefulness of a man who has waited longer than he knew for something this specific. And she kissed him back with the complete attention she brought to every important thing. And it was, she would think later, the best invested moment of her entire professional season. August moved through the Wyoming summer like something both urgent and slow, the way late summer in high country always does, knowing its own ending while insisting on its own heat. The ranch was coming alive around them in ways that felt almost personal. Briggs's 60 head arrived on schedule and integrated into the herd without incident. The south pasture, closed since April, had recovered beyond Sally's optimistic projections. Walking it in early August, she measured the grass height and density and wrote numbers in her field ledger that made her feel the particular satisfaction of seeing science proven in living green. The cattle moved through their rotation with the unhurried efficiency of a well-managed system. The fencing held. The North Boundary Creek ran clean and unrestricted. The Laramie connection held too. Forsyth wrote in early August confirming the fall drive route and the purchase terms, and Nathan and Sally sat with those numbers at the kitchen table the way they had begun to sit with everything important, side by side, her ledger open, his knowledge of the operational costs running as a steady commentary alongside her calculations, and the arithmetic came out to something that would cover the note, with enough left to carry the ranch through the winter and into a stronger spring. Dex Henderson filed no appeal. The 60-day window came and went without a word from his direction, and the water rights ruling became final, and the particular threat of that particular dark past closed itself like a wound healing. Sally noted it in the legal file with a satisfaction she did not bother to conceal. Nathan told her about it one evening while they were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the last light go off the mountains. "Henderson rode into Rawlings last week," he said. "Word is he's looking at selling part of his own operation. Appears the pressure he was putting on us was covering for the fact that his own numbers were worse than ours. That's often how aggression works," Sally said. "It's a distraction from a hidden vulnerability." Nathan looked at her with the quiet amusement he had developed specifically for the moments when she said something that was both analytically true and something he could not have said himself. "You're not surprised," he said. "I suspected it from the first week," she said. "His offer to buy the south section at 20 cents on the dollar was not the behavior of a man with capital to spend. It was the behavior of a man trying to acquire something cheap because his own resources were thin." She paused. "I probably should have said so earlier. You were focused on our problems." "Our problems," she repeated and smiled, and he caught the smile and felt it. He reached over and took her hand on the porch railing, and they watched the mountains go dark together. The fall drive was arranged for the last week of September, which would give them the time they needed before the October deadline on the note. Pike turned out to be an experienced trail hand in addition to his horse skills, and Clarence, despite his years, had done enough drives in his lifetime to be invaluable on the trail. Tommy was young and enthusiastic, and would learn more in a week on the drive than he had in a year of ranch work. And he knew it, and the knowing made him incandescent with the particular excitement of someone about to be tested. Sallie organized the logistics of the drive from the supply side, calculating the provisioning, coordinating with Forsyth's agent in Laramie about the receiving arrangements, and working out the overnight camping schedule based on the topography of the route Nathan had described. She did this with her usual systematic efficiency, and also with a private awareness that this drive, which she was organizing, was something she would not be accompanying. That awareness sat with her for several days before she mentioned it to Nathan. She mentioned it on a Tuesday morning in the third week of August, when they were riding the east fence line and the whole world was brilliant and the cattle were moving slowly in the distance and everything felt, for a suspended moment, completely workable. "I won't be on the drive," she said. Nathan looked over at her. "I'll stay and manage the ranch end. The cattle remaining here need tending, and there's the post-drive accounting to prepare in advance for the note payment meeting with Pitt." She was saying these things clearly and in order the way she always did, but something in her voice was off-key enough that he heard it. "Sallie," he said. "I'm aware of what comes after the drive," she said. "The season ends, the note gets paid. The original contract my employer drew up with your father specifies my engagement through the last day of October. After October, the formal arrangement concludes." "The formal arrangement," he said carefully. "I wanted to discuss it directly," she said, rather than let it arrive unexpectedly. He reined his horse to a stop and waited for her to do the same, and then he looked at her with a seriousness that had nothing nervous in it, only clarity. "I told you in July that I was in love with you," he said. "That has not changed. It has, if anything, become considerably less manageable." He paused. "Do you think I intend to let you walk out of my gate in October because a contract says your employment is concluded?" She met his eyes. "I think you are an honorable man who respects the terms of agreements." "I am," he said. "And the agreement I want to make with you has nothing to do with your employer in Denver." He paused again. "Sallie, I am going to ask you to marry me. Not today, because I intend to do it properly and not on a fence line in riding clothes. But I want you to know that the question is coming, so that you have time to think about it without being surprised." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had stood in his doorway on an April morning radiating stubborn grief and had, over the course of the most concentrated and meaningful 4 months of her professional and personal life, become the most important person in her world. "I appreciate the advance notice," she said. "I thought you'd prefer it," he said. "I would like to have the conversation before you purchase the ring," she said. "Not because the answer is uncertain, but because there are things we should discuss." "Name them." "My work," she said. "I don't intend to stop working. I'm not able to stop working. It is not a thing I'm capable of, and you should understand fully what that means before." "Sallie," he said, "this ranch is going to need a permanent consultant." She stopped. "The rotational grazing system you've set up will need ongoing management," he said. "The market relationships with Forsyth will need cultivation. The soil recovery program will need to be monitored and adjusted seasonally. The legal and financial management that has kept this operation from collapse will need to continue." He looked at her steadily. "I need someone who understands this land and this operation and is willing to work it as a full partner, not an employee and not a silent presence in a house. I need you to be here, Sallie, working as yourself." She took a breath. "The conversation," she said. "When would you like to have it?" "Tonight," he said, "at the kitchen table, where we have all the other important conversations." "All right," she said. They finished the fence line inspection and rode back to the ranch. The drive departed on the 23rd of September, which put it on schedule to arrive in Laramie well ahead of Forsyth's receiving window. Nathan rode out with it, because a man sends his foreman on a routine drive and rides himself on the drive that will determine whether he keeps his land, and Clarence and Tommy and Pike rode with him, and they took 309 head of Hale Ranch cattle down the trail toward Laramie while Sallie stood at the gate and watched them go. She had, by this point, made the private internal decision that she already knew was not reversible. She had made it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in August when Nathan had laid out, with the same honest directness he brought to every important conversation, the way he imagined their life together on this land, not just the practical arrangements of the ranch partnership, but the life itself, the particular life of two people who both love a piece of ground deeply and know how to work it and can imagine waking up on it together for a long time. She had told him about her stipulations. She had told him about her need to continue her professional work. She had told him that she wanted, someday, a family, but on terms that allowed her to remain who she was. She had told him about the fears she had been carrying, the fear of being reduced, the fear of being asked to make herself smaller for the sake of someone else's comfort. He had listened to all of it without interruption, and then he had said, "I am asking you to expand, Sallie, not to contract. I am asking you to run this ranch with me as a full partner. I am asking you to bring everything you are to this place. I am not asking for any version of you that is less than the whole thing." She had understood then that this man was, in the most precise and specific sense, her corresponding piece. With the drive away and the ranch quiet, Sallie spent the 11 days of the drive doing the advance accounting work, preparing the payment documentation for the note, writing her end-of-season report for her employer in Denver, and also in the evenings, writing a letter to the Denver Agricultural Advisory Board explaining that she would not be available for new assignments after October, because she had accepted a permanent position at a ranch in Carbon County, Wyoming, the terms of which she was happy to discuss if needed. She also, because it was a thing that needed doing, wrote to her mother in Missouri, whom she had not seen in 2 years, and told her about Nathan Hale. The drive returned on the 4th of October. Forsyth's payment arrived by telegraph to the Rawlings Bank on the 6th, and the amount was exactly what Sallie's projections had said it would be, which was enough to cover the note with $112 remaining. Nathan Hale paid Gerald Pitt's mortgage company on the 8th of October, 1884, in full, in the presence of the county agent Cartwright who witnessed the transaction, and he walked out of the land office in Rawlings into the October sun, and he felt the specific physical sensation of a man who has held his breath for a very long time and is now, for the first time, breathing. Sallie was waiting outside. He looked at her standing there in the October afternoon with her dark hair and her clear eyes and her notebook tucked under one arm because she never went anywhere without something to write in, and he felt it again, that thing he had been feeling since late April, only now it was without the overlay of crisis and deadline and everything at stake. It was just the thing itself, clear and substantial and permanent. He took off his hat. "Sallie Wainwright," he said, "I believe this is the moment I mentioned." She looked at him. "You mentioned doing it properly." "I did," he said. He had been to the jewelry shop on the previous evening while she was finishing her accounting work, and the ring he had bought was small and simple and made by a craftsman in Rawlings who worked in the local style, silver set with a piece of turquoise the color of the Wyoming sky. He took it out of his coat pocket and he held it out. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "I am asking you to be my partner on this land and in this life. I am asking this not because you saved my ranch, though you did, and I will never forget it. I am asking because you are the person I want to sit across the table from for the rest of my life." Sallie looked at the ring and looked at him, and she said, "Yes, Nathan," and her voice was level and clear, because she was a woman who had learned to say the important things directly, and this was the most important thing she had ever said. He put the ring on her finger, and he kissed her on the street in front of the Rawlings land office in the October sunshine. And Clarence, who had insisted on driving them to town in the buckboard on the grounds that his legs were tired, looked away and found something very interesting to study in the far distance. They were married 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in late October, by the minister at the small non-denominational church in Rawlings that served the range community between Rawlings and Laramie. The wedding was not a large affair. Cartwright came. Forsyth came up from Laramie. Briggs came from Sweetwater County. Tommy, who had developed a deeply admiring attachment to both of them, came in his good shirt with his hair carefully combed. Clarence stood up as a witness, in a suit that had been purchased for a purpose he did not specify. Sallie wore a dress she had ordered by post from Denver, blue-gray wool that turned her eyes the color of creek water in good light, and she wore her hair in a way that managed the pins more successfully than usual. And when she came down the aisle of that small church and looked at Nathan standing at the front of it, she felt something that she later described in her journal as the particular sensation of a problem precisely and perfectly solved, and also as something entirely unlike a problem. Nathan looked at her coming toward him and thought, "This is the best thing that has ever happened on this ground or any other ground." The ceremony was simple and quick, as frontier ceremonies tended to be, and the minister was a practical man who understood that the people who came to him for weddings in October were people with operations to get back to before the cold came in, and he said the words that needed saying with the efficiency they deserved, and Nathan and Sallie said theirs, and it was done. The following Monday, Sallie Wainwright, now Sallie Hale, sat down at the kitchen table she had occupied since April and opened her ledger for the winter planning cycle. The grazing rotation for the spring needed to be drafted. The South Pasture soil recovery metrics needed to be reviewed and adjusted for the next season's program. The cattle feed supply for the winter needed to be inventoried and augmented. The Forsyth relationship needed to be formally renewed for the following fall. Nathan sat down across from her with his coffee and watched her work. "You're already planning the next season," he said. "The next season starts in April," she said, without looking up. "It's October. We have 6 months." "6 months," he said. "I have some ideas about how to use them." She looked up at him with the slight curve of her mouth that had been his favorite expression on her face since early May, and said, "I imagine you do." Winter came in with the particular quality of Wyoming winters, heavy and deliberate and deeply cold, settling over the Hale Ranch like a second landscape. The work of winter was different from the work of the warmer seasons, less visible but not less real. The constant monitoring of the herd through cold snaps, the maintenance of the water supply against freezing, the ongoing fence repair work that the autumn hadn't completed, the hay supply management that would determine how the cattle came out of spring. Nathan and Sallie worked it together with the natural, unself-conscious partnership of people who have already established their rhythms and don't need to renegotiate them. She managed the supply accounts and the market correspondence. He managed the daily livestock operations and the physical maintenance of the property. In the evenings they compared notes and made plans, and sat by the fire in the front room that Sallie had gradually made more habitable with things she had ordered by post from Denver. A second chair, a reading lamp, a small bookshelf that she filled with an assortment of agricultural journals, and 2 novels she had been carrying in her carpetbag since Missouri. Nathan read one of the novels, a 3-week process during which he asked her questions about the characters as if they were people he might encounter, which she found both charming and completely characteristic. She wrote to her mother in January, and her mother wrote back, and there was in her mother's letter a cautious but genuine happiness that Sallie read and reread in the cold kitchen light. In February, she told Nathan that she thought they might be expecting a child. He was at the barn at the time, and she had walked out in her coat to tell him because she had found, since the diagnosis of the previous day when she had quietly consulted the medical guide she had acquired before leaving for Wyoming, that she did not want to keep the information longer than necessary, and the kitchen table felt too far away. He turned from the horse he was tending and looked at her standing in the barn doorway with the winter light behind her and her expression carefully composed in the way it got when she was telling him something that mattered more than usual. He said, "Are you certain?" "Fairly certain," she said. "The book suggests another month before absolute certainty." He crossed the barn and took her hands in both of his and looked at her with an expression that was not manageable in any ordinary way and said her name, and she felt the weight of it. "Sallie," he said, "this is the most wonderful." He stopped, tried again. "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I'm feeling completely fine," she said. "The guidebook says the first trimester can produce some fatigue, and I may need to adjust the physical work slightly, but otherwise I intend to continue the work," he said, and he was almost laughing because of course she did. "The work," she confirmed. He kissed her in the cold barn with the horses watching, and outside the Wyoming winter was absolute and white, and the Hale Ranch sat in it the way it had sat in every winter for 12 years, the way it would sit in every winter that came after this one. And inside it, two people who had arrived at this moment by routes neither of them would have predicted were beginning the particular ongoing story that goes on long after the crisis is solved and the season is over. Spring came back as it always does to the high Wyoming grassland, a little tentative in March and then committed in April, the grass running back into the pastures with the vigor of returning things, the cottonwoods along the drainage greening from the bottom up. On the first morning of April, which was the anniversary of Sally's arrival, and which she did not mention but Nathan had noted in his private memory since February, she stood on the porch in the early light and looked out at the ranch and felt the particular doubled quality of the moment. Here and also the previous here. Herself on this porch a year ago with a carpetbag and a plan and a man in the doorway who did not want her here. Nathan came and stood beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "1 year ago this morning," he said, "you grabbed my letter out of my hand," she said. "I was grieving and threatened," he said. "In retrospect, it was not my finest hour. In retrospect," she said, "it was the beginning of the best year of my life." He handed her the coffee and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the easy comfort of a woman settled into her place, and they looked out at the pastures, the south section lush and recovered, the north section holding its fence, the herd distributed across the rotational sections in the pattern she had designed, and that now ran itself with the trained momentum of a good system, and above everything the Wyoming sky doing its enormous, unhurried work. She was 4 months along, and visible as such in the slight rounding of her figure, and she had not once stopped working, which Nathan had long since stopped suggesting might be worth reconsidering. Cartwright had written in February to tell them that Henderson's operation had filed for foreclosure proceedings, and that the Henderson property would likely be absorbed by the Territorial Land Authority and offered at auction by summer. Nathan had discussed with Sallie whether to put in a bid for the north section, which bordered their own, and would give them access to additional water and pasture. They had run the numbers together and decided that this year the money was better spent on building the herd foundation, and that if Henderson's land came up for auction again in future seasons, they would be in a stronger position to act. They were thinking in seasons, plural, which was a different way of thinking than the single-season survival calculus that had structured the previous year. Forsyth had renewed and extended the purchasing agreement for the 1885 season, this time with a higher volume commitment that reflected the ranch's demonstrated capacity. Walter Briggs had written to ask if there was any chance of a similar cattle purchase arrangement this spring, and Nathan had written back yes, with terms, and Sallie had drafted the terms, and the arrangement was in place. Tommy had asked in March if he could take on an increased responsibility level, something closer to foreman, because Clarence's knees were making the full-day outdoor work harder on him than he'd let on. Nathan had said yes, and had told Clarence that his role was being adjusted, that he would continue to be paid and housed, and that his knowledge of this operation was irreplaceable, and that being freed from the physical daily work would allow him to do the things that his 40 years of ranch experience actually made him irreplaceable for, which was the knowledge that no one else had. Clarence had said, "That's a kindly way to handle it, boy," and gone inside. Pike had left in February for a ranch in Montana where he'd been offered a head horse handler position. He'd shaken Nathan's hand and nodded to Sallie and ridden north without ceremony, which was consistent with everything else about him. Nathan hired a new hand in April, a young man named Elton who came with references from Cartwright and turned out to be capable and reliable, and not at all bothered by the fact that the ranch was run by a woman with a ledger, and a man with a way of looking at his wife that made clear who he would follow if the two of them ever disagreed, which they did occasionally and productively, and never irresolvably. The spring season moved through May with the vigorous momentum of a recovered system finding its strength. The calving numbers were good, better than Nathan's best projections, and Sallie walked the calving areas with her field notebook and noted the numbers with the same careful satisfaction she brought to every metric that confirmed a projection. She wrote to her employer in Denver, formally closing her consulting account and recommending 2 of the board's other consultants for the assignments that had been in her queue. She also wrote suggesting that the board consider formalizing the type of on-site residency consulting she had done at Hale Ranch as a service model, because the results of a season-long engagement versus a short visit consultation were demonstrably better, and she attached her end-of-season report as evidence. The board director wrote back saying this was a thoughtful suggestion and that she would be missed, and that they hoped she was well. She wrote back saying she was very well. In June, on a quiet Thursday afternoon when the ranch was in its midday lull and the summer heat was building toward its peak, Sallie was at the kitchen table working on the projected fall drive numbers when she felt the baby move for the first time, a small, unmistakable flutter that stopped her pen mid-number. She sat very still, listening inward, and felt it again. She called Nathan's name out the open kitchen window. She did not shout it, but she put something in it that brought him from the barn at something faster than his usual walk. He came through the door and she took his hand and placed it against her, and they waited, and after a moment it came again, and she watched his face change completely. He sat down on the edge of the table with her hand still held against her, and he said nothing at all for what felt like a full minute. And when he looked at her, his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, even through everything they had been through, even through the water rights victory and the note payment and their wedding day. "Hello," he said softly, not to her but to the unseen presence between his hand and hers. She laughed, and it was the full, uncomplicated laugh of a woman who had somehow, between one April morning and this June afternoon, arrived exactly where she was supposed to be. Summer stretched long and warm over the Hale Ranch, and the cattle moved through their rotations with the unhurried purpose of a well-run herd, and the grass came in so thick on the south pasture that Sallie revised her soil recovery metrics for the 4th time, and each revision was better than the last. And the north boundary creek ran clear and unrestricted, and Nathan rode his fence lines in the early mornings with the peace of a man who has stopped bracing against loss. He had not fully understood, until the previous season, how much of his daily energy had been spent in that bracing, the anticipatory grief of a man waiting for the thing he loves to be taken away. He had lived in it so long he had stopped knowing it was there. Sallie, with her plan and her ledger and her clear-eyed refusal to pretend that broken things couldn't be fixed, had dismantled that posture by making the ranch survivable. But it was not the ranch's survival that had ended the bracing. It was the specific quality of not being alone, of having someone beside him who was equally committed to this land and equally capable of meeting the challenges it brought, and who also, in the kitchen in the evenings with her hair coming down and her pen moving, was the best sight he had ever seen at the end of a working day. He had not known, before Sallie Wainwright arrived on an April morning with a carpetbag and a plan, that it was possible to feel this way about a person and a place simultaneously, that the two feelings could reinforce each other rather than compete, that loving someone could make a landscape more itself rather than pulling you away from it. He knew it now. The fall drive in 1885 went off in the last week of September, as it had the year before, but this time the numbers were substantially better. 348 head, their own herd plus 40 from Briggs under the shared drive arrangement, and Forsyth's offered price had been locked in at an even more favorable rate because Nathan and Sallie had leveraged the previous year's delivery record to negotiate from a position of demonstrated reliability rather than need. Nathan rode out with the drive. Clarence's detailed knowledge of the Laramie route proved invaluable in helping Tommy, who was running his first drive as acting foreman, navigate two route decisions that would have cost them a day. Elton was steady and capable on the trail. They arrived in Laramie 2 days ahead of the receiving window and camped outside the city, and Nathan sent a telegraph to Sallie that said, 348 head arrived in good condition. Coming home soon. All my love, Nathan. Sallie received the telegraph in the kitchen of the ranch house on a September evening, when she was 8 months along, and the baby was making his preferences about her sitting position abundantly clear. She read it twice and pressed it flat on the table and felt the full warm satisfaction of everything she had worked for and everything she had built, both the professional thing and the personal thing, both the ledger and the life. She had become, over the course of the past 17 months on this land, something she had not had language for when she arrived. Not just a consultant and not just a wife and not just a woman with a good head for numbers. She had become part of the living system of this ranch, woven into its operations and its recovery and its future with the same irreversibility that the water rights ruling had woven the North Creek into the property's legal map. She had never felt so completely herself in any other place. Nathan came home on the 5th of October, and he walked through the kitchen door, and she stood up carefully from the kitchen table, and he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her with the specific gentleness required by her current situation, and he held her for a long moment without speaking. "How is he doing?" Nathan said, pulling back to look at her. "He's been kicking since Tuesday," she said. "That's my son," he said, with a quiet pride that she found entirely acceptable. "It might be a daughter," she said. "It might be," he said, "though I'll note you just said he." "Force of habit," she said, and he laughed. The payment on the 1885 fall drive was deposited into the account Nathan held at the Rawlings Bank on the 10th of October, and the amount was enough to carry the ranch through the next 2 years of operations without debt pressure, with a surplus adequate to fund the proposed East Section improvements that Sallie had been designing since July. She showed Nathan the final version of the East Section plan on the evening of the 10th, and they reviewed it together at the kitchen table, her numbers and his land knowledge combining as they always did into something better than either of them alone. He signed off on the plan, and she folded it into her ledger, and he said, "What's next on the list?" She looked at him across the table with the lamp between them and said, "A family, I believe, in about 2 weeks." It was 14 days, as it turned out. A boy, born on a Wednesday morning in late October 1885 in the bedroom of the Hale Ranch house, with the assistance of the midwife from Rawlings whom Sallie had arranged 3 months in advance with her characteristic thoroughness. He was healthy and loud and had, from his first hours, a quality of focused attention to the world around him that Nathan said was entirely his mother's. They named him Elias, after the man who had started everything by writing a letter to a consulting board in Denver. Clarence cried in the kitchen when Nathan told him, and then fiercely denied having done so. Sallie, lying in bed with her son on her chest in the October afternoon, and Nathan sitting on the edge of the mattress with his hand covering both of them, felt the completeness of it, not the completeness of an ending but the completeness of a foundation, a thing solid and well built enough to build more upon. "We need to hire another hand for the spring," she said. Nathan looked at her. "The East Section improvements will require additional labor through May and June," she said. "I want to run the numbers on whether it makes more sense to hire seasonal versus permanent." "You just had a baby 4 hours ago," Nathan said. "The numbers are in my head regardless," she said. "I might as well say them." He looked at her for a long moment, this woman with her son against her chest and her ledger on the nightstand and her mind running its clear, unstoppable calculations. And his expression was the expression of a man who has been given everything he needed and more than he expected, and he said, "Permanent. We can afford it. We should start building a permanent crew." She nodded. "I'll write the advertisement next week." "Next week," he agreed. Little Elias made a sound that was not entirely approving of being used as a backdrop for ranch planning, and both his parents looked at him with the immediate, slightly startled attention of people encountering a new and non-negotiable priority. And Sallie adjusted her hold and the baby settled, and the ranch outside the window was going gold in the late afternoon, and the October sky over Wyoming was enormous and clear, and the mountains were already white, and the Hale Ranch sat in it all. Mended and recovered and alive, the way things that have been carefully tended and honestly worked can come to be. The following spring, April of 1886, on a morning that felt very specifically like the echo of another April morning 2 years before, Sallie stood at the kitchen table with her ledger open and the season's plan spread out before her, and she heard the sound of a wagon coming up the road. Nathan came in from the barn and looked out the window. "Someone coming," he said. "Elton's cousin," Sallie said without looking up. "He's the new permanent hand. He was supposed to arrive today." "Can you show him the bunkhouse?" Nathan looked at her for a moment and then went to meet the wagon. She made a note in her ledger about the East Section fencing schedule and listened to Nathan's voice outside, welcoming a new person to the operation, and little Elias in his basket near the stove made the small, contented sounds of a baby in a warm room. And outside the pastures were green and the creek was running, and the cattle were moving through their rotation with the steady, unhurried purpose of a healthy herd. It was a good morning in a long line of good mornings that stretched back to the one where it had all begun, and forward into a future that was not without difficulty, because no future is, but that was built on ground that had been worked and known and loved by people who understood both its limits and its enormous capacity to recover, to grow, to sustain. Nathan came back inside. He poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from Sallie, and she looked up from her ledger. "East Section fencing," she said. "I want to start the first week of May." "The first week of May it is," he said. He pushed one of the coffee cups toward her. She took it without looking away from her numbers. He watched her face in the morning light, the same face that had stood at his gate 2 years ago with a plan and a carpetbag and no intention whatsoever of being turned away. He thought of his father's hands writing that letter, and he thought, "You knew, didn't you? You knew exactly what you were sending." Elias Hale the younger had been awake since 5 that morning, but had fallen back asleep in his basket with the particular boneless peace of a well-fed infant, and the ranch was quiet in the early April day, and Nathan Hale sat across the kitchen table from his wife and thought, "This is the whole of it. This is the actual thing. Everything broken had been fixed. Everything lost had been either recovered or grieved and released. The debt was gone, the threat was resolved, the land was whole, the herd was strong, and the woman who had arrived on a first morning with a plan had stayed, not because the contract required it, but because she had found, as he had found, that this was exactly where they both belonged. Spring was beginning. The season was open. The work was good. And from the basket near the stove, young Elias made a sound that strongly suggested he had opinions about the direction of the morning, and both his parents looked at him, and Sallie closed her ledger, and Nathan stood up, and together they went to see what was needed. Outside, the Wyoming grassland was waking up under a sky so blue it ached, and the Hale Ranch was alive and whole in it, and there was nothing else to be except what they were, exactly here, exactly now, with everything ahead of them and nothing unresolved behind them, and the ground under all of it solid as the thing that had built it, which was work, and love, and the particular, stubborn, clear-eyed insistence that broken things are worth the effort of fixing.